Welcome to Brian Terrell. I think that's it correctly, Terrell.
Or Terrell, if you would do it.
Or Terrell. To the jail and protest. I'm looking to learn something myself because I have my own opinion of that. So I'm learning to wait to hear what Brian has to say because he has been very well invested in it. So, Brian, take over.
Well, thanks. Yeah, this there's a little bit of introduction. I've been with the Catholic Worker since 1975. Dropped out of school after 1 year. So I've been with the movement roughly half of its existence. So that's my perspective. And so I went to college for a year, and I've been in prison for probably more than 2 years, in little bits and pieces. And just so that's what, kind of where I'm coming from. It was before my time, back in 1968. State violence was rampant. Foreign wars in the streets of our cities, and the world was threatened by the arrogance of some crazy men with power. Dorothy Day drew from her experience and tradition in the industrial workers of the world, who had the tactic of filling the jails. That was our best hope for the peril of the time. And before that, Gandhi had said, social betterment never comes from parliaments or pulpits, but from direct action in the streets, from the courts, the jails, and sometimes even the gallows. Dorothy's and Gandhi's advice may be well taken, and these are even more violent and dangerous days than theirs. Even if fewer Catholic workers avail themselves of it, their plan offers the best chance, I think, for a practical program for the healing of our planet, for the health of our movement, of the Catholic worker movement, and for the malaise that inflicts the souls of all of us. I read from Mark Colville, our friend and brother who's in the New Haven Catholic worker, who's wrote an article, Rattling the Bars of My Cage, from his jail in Georgia. He says, one of the blessings that has flowed in abundance during this time of incarceration is reflectiveness. A mental and spiritual focus, which I often find difficult to access with consistency out there in minimum security, which seems to be an increasingly apt description of U.S. society these days. A jail cell can be very effective at stripping away the illusions and delusions that define me, what sustains me, and prominent and even more hopefully permanent when viewing the world from the perspective, it's more than a radicalization of thought and conscience that becomes prominent and hopefully permanent when viewing the world from the perspective of the bottom. On a more fundamental level, with time there comes a possibility of a kind of rebooting of the self, as the desert does its work on the ego, which can easily impede the work of the Holy Spirit in habitually unrecollected souls such as mine. The notion of discipleship in a culture of death gradually shifts from the realm of the spiritual aspiration to deeply felt invitation to move from here to there. This is the well I've been drinking more thirstily from in the weeks as the weeks have turned into months, and I must remember to thank the U.S. District Court for its obvious devotion to my spiritual health. And Mark quotes Jim Douglas, in contemplating prison consequences which may be measured not so much in days and weeks as in months and years, I must confront the reality of prison not as an interlude in a middle-class existence, a white middle-class existence, but a stage on the way of redefining my life. Dorothy Day was jailed as a young woman agitating for the vote, and she writes this about her first experience behind bars from the autobiography, The Long Loneliness. I lost all consciousness of any cause. I could only feel darkness and desolation all around me. That I would be free again after 30 days meant nothing to me. I would never be free again. Never free when I knew that behind bars all over the world there are women and men young girls and boys suffering constraint, punishment, isolation, and hardship for crimes for which all of us are guilty. One big influence on Dorothy Day and other young activists of her time was Eugene Debs, who, for his protests against World War I, he was sentenced to 10 years in prison and stripped of his citizenship. And he had been in jail awaiting trial, and when he appeared before the judge for sentencing, he said this, Your Honor, years ago I recognized my kinship with all living beings, and I made up my mind that I am not one bit better than the meanest on earth. I said then, and I say it now, while there is a lower class, I am in it. While there is a criminal element, I am of it. And while there is a soul in prison, I am not free. That's my good fortune. I came to the Catholic Worker in New York when I was 19 years old, in 1975. And I was there in the community in Dorothy's last years. In the spring of 1977, there was a huge demonstration and occupation of the Seabrook nuclear power plant that was under construction then. And most of the young people in the community took the trip up there thinking they were going to get arrested and released right away. But that didn't happen, and they were held for several weeks. And life was very difficult at the house with so few people left to run things. And Dorothy saw me and was furious. What are you doing here? Your comrades are in prison. Why are you here? And I said, Dorothy, I cooked the soup. And she told me that it was reprehensible that I was using the works of mercy and the needs of the house as an excuse for not doing what she thought I should do. Now, I think that she was wrong. I bristled at that scolding, and it was out of line. I found when Robert Ellsberg published some of her collection of her letters, I found something that she wrote to Dean Maurer in 1977 that shed some light on her frame of mind at the time. With everyone else taking responsibility and having taken it for so long and bearing so much, she wrote, I feel like an utter failure, wrung dry. I am beginning to recover from the miserable state of depression. Meanwhile, I pray, listen to the radio, and thank God that the great demonstration at Seabrook is over. But a year later, I was vindicated in her eyes, at least for a little while. Dorothy wrote in her column in the Catholic Worker, I rejoice to see the young people thinking of the works of mercy as a truly revolutionary but nonviolent program. The spiritual and the corporal certainly go together and often involve suffering. To oppose nuclear buildup has led to the imprisonment of last month of two of our workers, Robert Ellsberg and Brian Terrell, in Rocky Flats, Colorado. Meanwhile, I am confined in another way by weakness and age. But I can truly pray with fervor for those on active duty and sternly suppress my envy at the activities of our young and valiant workers. So one of the writers that Dorothy often recommended was Fyodor Dostoevsky. And in The House of the Dead, he wrote, the degree of civilization can be judged by, the degree of civilization in society can be judged by entering its prisons. And I think to a certain extent, especially in a society like ours, that historic rates of mass incarceration, especially today, to understand the world that we live in, it's important to see it from the prison cell, more than ever. A jail, in Dorothy's view, Dorothy thought that the jail was a good place to be educated, but the university, on the other hand, not so much. She valued scholarship, but she wrote to Addie Bethune in 1948, I do not think much of degrees in graduating. In her later
There goes my
years,
career.
I'll get to you, Harry.
You're forgiven.
In her later years, Dorothy, who dropped out of the University of Illinois after a year, was plagued by offers of honorary degrees. We know of at least 16 Catholic universities that offered her honorary doctorates. The very offer of an honorary degree, she wrote, means that in a way I have failed to convey, to popularize Peter Morin's teachings. This is what she wrote to the president of Santa Clara University in 1976. Anybody who'd offer Dorothy Day an honorary doctorate didn't get her. Turning down the honor from the Catholic University of America, she wrote a letter to that school's president. The Catholic worker stands in a particular way for the poor and the lowly, the people who need some other kind of schooling than afforded by universities and colleges in our industrial capitalist system. I have a deep conviction that we must stay as close to the poor, as close to the bottom as we can, to walk the little way, in St. Teresa's words. In that letter, she expressed admiration for the theory of education promoted by Julius Nyerere, the socialist Catholic president of Tanzania, who he advocated for, rather than trying to train an intellectual or technical elite, sending a few people to universities that would then raise up, be leaders and raise up the rest of the people that you need to raise the people. That the education should be based on the community. He didn't want to get people, prepare young, bright people for leadership slots in a hierarchical society. That he thought that was that kind of education transmits the values of colonizing power. So that idea resonated with Dorothy, and Dorothy's co-founder, fellow college dropout, Peter Morin, who insisted scholars become workers and workers become scholars. Plowshares activist and Catholic worker John Schuchart is remembered as explaining that there are two competing institutions of higher learning: universities and prisons. Universities teach about the world at the top looking down. Prisons teach looking at, from the bottom, looking up. Okay. For generations of nonviolent resistors, Catholic workers among them, jail has been an experience that has redefined our lives, as Jim Douglas puts it. This is not true today anymore, and our movement is poorer for it, intellectually as well as spiritually. Till maybe 20 years ago, any chance collection of Catholic workers, young and old, would have included at least a number of men and women, if not a majority, who'd spent weeks or months, if not years, in jails and prisons. Until recent decades, there were always more Catholic workers with criminal records than with university degrees.
Some have both.
Some have both. I think it's a scandalous demographic phenomenon in these times of mass incarceration, where the general population of this country, more and more people are being put in prison. If you look at the people of color, more and more young people of color are in prison, a bigger portion of our population than ever before. And at this time of all times, there are fewer Catholic workers in prison. I think this fact may be critical to understanding the generational dissonance. And I was very happy to be at that we had a plenary with the issue of racism, and Lincoln and Maria. I think we've come a long way from a statement that was issued a few months ago, lament, repent, and repair. But it wasn't so much, I think, a generational thing, is that for the folks who composed that, there were no convicts among them. It was a voice that was not a part of that. And when it was raised later, it was reacted to as pushback. So graduate school has taken the place of prison in the formation of many who've joined the Catholic worker in recent years. Far too much time spent in school, far too little time in a prison cells by too many young Catholic workers threatens to paralyze our movement with abstractions issued in the jargon of an academic elite. During the war against the people of Vietnam, Dan Berrigan suggested that in the course of such a war, one had to go to jail. It was an irreplaceable need, a gift not to be refused. You got arrested, were stripped, your body searched and poked for drugs, you stood in public showers, issued denims, were herded about, segregated, counted at odd hours, yelled at, all for the good. After all, the scene was no Dachau, and you would come out the other side a few pounds lighter, the skin of your soul darkened by the insight, the fate of the poor, the blacks, knowing what justice is for the poor. Ammon Hennessy told Utah Phillips, you came into the world armed to the teeth with an arsenal of weapons. The weapons of privilege, economic privilege, sexual privilege, racial privilege. You want to be a pacifist? You're not just going to have to give up the guns, knives, guns, clubs, hard, angry words. You're going to have to lay down the weapons of privilege and go into the world completely disarmed. Now, privilege admittedly follows white people even to jail, and it's extraordinary privilege I found that for the most part hasn't always worked. I get to pick when I go to jail. And make sure that my chores are covered by other people and things, and for most people they don't have that. And even the privilege of refusing to pay a fine when you could. The privilege of getting on the phone and talking to your family and saying, no, don't bother with the bail. I'll sit this out, I'll go to court, I'll be in court in 2 weeks, they'll cut me loose, don't pay the bond. And hearing my friends, fellow cellmates on the phone telling their families, get me the money, get me out of here. It's a privilege to have that choice. Now, last January, I was arrested in Washington, D.C. at the White House by the Secret Service and demonstration calling for closing the prison at Guantanamo. And because of some unfinished business in Nevada, the police held me. I was taken to Central Cell Block and went through the whole process, and more than 24 hours in Central Cell Block and in the cells of Superior Court, there were about 100 men in our group. I was the only white man. I don't care what your politics are, if you're Democrat or Republican, everybody in this country can name a whole bunch of powerful white men in Washington, D.C. who they think belong in jail. Committing the most heinous of crimes. The only way, it was fun because I've been in jail in D.C. before. Nobody asks me, are you a protester? They look at me and look at my skin and say, what are you protesting? Because the only way a white man is going to get into Central Cell Block is by confronting the system directly and protesting it. Everybody else is in there for piddly crimes, non-paid traffic fines, and going through that horrible mill. And by the, again, I consider it a very deep privilege, and I was there in a sense voluntarily. So after 24 hours, they decided they were not going to extradite me to Las Vegas. They had other things to do. But I think to get back to the statement, and I'm sorry the folks who've been involved in that aren't here. And I want to, this is very hard to say, and I mean it humbly, I think. I'm not being supercilious. That this statement, people have largely chosen to refuse the gift that Dan Berrigan talks about and refuse the redefinition of our lives that prison offers. And incidentally, keep their privilege intact, their options open for upward mobility, and have their resumes unsullied by prison records. Phil Berrigan admitted once, and I think he was probably under duress, that not everyone needs to go do nonviolent direct action that leads to jail. But he did insist that more people need to do that than are doing it. I want to be clear, I'm not saying everyone needs to go to jail. Every one of us has to discern the role we're to play. known to feel coerced by some kind of groupthink, but it makes a difference, and it hurts in our deliberation and discourses and our clarification of thought that there are so few young convicts among us. We need that voice. And I don't want to dismiss the contributions made to our movement and its work by the academics among us. Dorothy did not disown Catholic workers who chose to pursue academic accreditation, and sometimes especially encouraged those who went after formal education, especially those who wanted to be, teachers, lawyers, doctors, nurses. I'm not trying to set up some kind of rule or standard for everyone. Now, Harry Murray, I'll get to you, Harry. Our host here, I think, practices admirably what he calls a scholarship of resistance, and managed even to turn his resistance into a professional advantage, padding his CV, so to speak, with articles published on first-hand direct actions. Resistance, Harry says, can also lead to a much wider range of writing and presentations, which I will argue have scholarly value in themselves, even if a rank and tenure committee may not agree. So it's not always necessary to quit one's job, but it's often necessary to risk losing one's job. And I don't want to romanticize the prison experience. Nobody who's been there can. Far from trying to put any kind of glamour or shine on it, I'm saying the opposite. That going to jail from time to time should be viewed as prosaic, as routine, as ordinary, and no more special than washing the dishes, working in the garden, cutting vegetables, watching the house,
Getting the newsletter
out. The list can go on. So, but more than our own spiritual recollection and the integrity for our movement, the lives of hurting brothers and sisters and the life of this planet is at stake. Nonviolent direct action is taught to us by Jesus, Gandhi, and the peace walkers and peace volunteers in Afghanistan, to name a few, are the most likely and practical way out. As Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. put it, the choice is no longer nonviolence or violence, it's nonviolence or non-existence. Now, the resurgence of the Poor People's Campaign around the country this summer has been exciting and energizing. It really has been fun to hear the old songs from 1968 resurrected and being sung again. One of these is "Everybody's Got a Right to Live." If you've been to any of their events, you would have heard that. Recently at the Voices office, Kathy was hosting some people, including Medea Benjamin, and Medea brought up some discomfort over the lyric that goes, "Before this campaign fails, we'll all go down to jail." Now, I apologize, I respect tradition, and I know that it wrecks the rhyming scheme. But more accurate and hopeful way to put it would be, before this campaign succeeds, we'll all end up in jail. Phil Berrigan might have been speaking about our present dilemma when he offered that in this morally polluted atmosphere, we believe that imprisonment could hardly be more to the point. We shudder under the blows of a society permanently mobilized against peace. Duplicity, propaganda, media indifference, institutional betrayal mark our plight. Our people are confused and hopeless. Let us not give up hope. Let us continue to nourish each other by consistent and prayerful presence at military installations, in courts and lockups. Indeed, we need to be free enough to go to jail. We need to fill the jails. nonviolent revolution will come out of the wilderness as it always has. And be assured, dear friends, one formidable wilderness today is the American prison. So, reactions, and how arrogant was that?